We're pleased to have two of the authors from this publication speak to us today in our webinar. Jan Niesen is the director of the Migration Policy Group, an independent policy agency in Brussels, Belgium. His work includes comparative research projects such as the Migrant Integration Policy Index, or MIPEX, as well as work on anti-discrimination and diversity. Meyer Simiatycki is professor of politics and public administration at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. Much of Meyer's work focuses on immigrant and minority civic participation, transnationalism, and minority religion in the public realm. Jan and Meyer, welcome. Thank you both for joining us today.
Delighted to be here.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon.
The presentations will be followed by a question and answer period. So let's begin our presentations with Jan Niesen, who will talk to us about the relationship between national and local policy in immigration and integration. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you very much. And again, good morning or good afternoon to all of you. Let me start by saying that picking up on what is often said in policy discourses, that all integration is local, that may be true. The question, of course, is whether all policies are local and whether all integration policies are local. I will argue in 3 points that I think that is not the case. And that brings me to my first slide. The first slide and the first point I wanted to make to challenge the idea that all policies and integration policies are local it has to do with the very nature of the issue we are talking about. This is about international migration, international migrants who settle somewhere, usually in cities across the globe. And they end up in a very dynamic environment. They came from places to which they may return. They may have their family coming over. But not only persons move, also capital, services, and goods are moving. In a dynamic world, almost everything seems to be on the move. People communicate with each other without even moving, such as we are now doing, listening to each other and speaking to each other. So basically what I'm saying is that you can, as individual, not locate your challenges and opportunities in just one place. Too much is going on that affects you wherever you are and wherever you go. And if you cannot locate opportunities and challenges in one place, you cannot locate policies in one place. Second point is that we all believe, I think, in division of labor, and that we have to really understand the dynamics between local, regional, national, and international policy dynamics, how they interplay. And that we have to address problems and seize opportunities where they really arise. Now, with migration and integration, that is not only local. People, by definition, leave one place to go to another, and they become more than local. And if we want to address that particular issue, for example, why they are leaving, and make sure that when they arrive something, they can really contribute to prosperity in cities where they settle. We have to go to the places where that occurs, which is more, as I set out, than in one place. Now, if I then go to the next slide, those of you in policy making, be it as an actor or an analyst like myself, we know that policy making is basically a balancing act. That we constantly have to look at a balance between general and specific interventions, between global policies and local policies. And if we then look at the policy actors in more particular, we look actually at integration as make societal organizations and entities more inclusive. And then, if we recognize that as the core business of integration policies, making organizations and societal institutions and entities more inclusive, then the difference between local, national, and regional doesn't play such a big role anymore. The differences between governmental entities and non-governmental entities in all of this is very similar as well. Governments and non-governmental organizations should provide working opportunities with which a diverse population is comfortable. Goods and services need to be rendered to a diverse population, and these entities must buy their goods and services from among a diverse supply base. And so here, as I said, the whole distinction between national, regional, and local doesn't play a role anymore. Now, usually we see at the local level that local policy actors see what is happening at higher levels as a constraint more than an opportunity, and these actors try to influence the policy-making machinery, and they do that in particular in those areas which I have summarized, which are of great importance for life in the city. What would it be, and how would national policies work out if governments don't adopt naturalization policies? Citizenship needs to be promoted, and usually national laws need to be adapted to that effect. Political participation is not something local authorities decide upon. Usually that requires a national piece of legislation. Education, the setting of standards and the providing of money usually is a national issue or a regional issue, and cities usually have more or less room of maneuver to implement these policies. And last but not least, issues related to residence and family reunion. Usually, it is within the competence of national governments, and the best local authorities can do is join forces with other cities, with local players at the civil society organizations to influence national policies. And so I would leave it at this by way of introduction.
Thank you, Jan. I'd like to remind everyone that if you have questions for our speakers, please write them into the question box on the left side of your screen. You can write in your questions at any time. We will be asking the questions to both of our speakers after the presentations during the question period. So next, let's move on to our second presentation. Meyer Semioticki will be talking to us about cities, public spaces, and what they can tell us about integration. Meyer?
Thank you very much, Bonnie. I'm delighted to be part of this interesting and important discussion. Jan has been very efficient in his use of time. I will try not to go over time, as I sometimes do. This is a very important discussion. It brings together two dynamics, urbanization and immigration, that are transforming the way we live and the world we live in. This is often referred to as the age of migration. And it's true, of course, that the vast majority of immigrants now settle and live in our cities. And if you bear with me a moment, I will bring the slides that correspond with this presentation onto screen. There we are. There's the title, and there's the first slide. So we have a situation where there is more international population movement and migration than ever. The vast majority of it settling in cities. Increasingly, too, it's the action of cities, it's the role of cities through their local governments and their community institutions that will determine the outcomes of immigration, both for immigrants and for the receiving society. Jan has rightly pointed out national governments play an important role. Increasingly, however, we are seeing that role focus on selection, security, and border control. It's local governments that increasingly are taking up the challenge of how do we actually make immigration work on the ground, how do we operationalize to be able to get the best benefits for the host society and for immigrants themselves. So in my talk today, what I'd like to do is continue with some remarks about the general theme of the significance and role of local government as leaders in immigrant integration. And secondly, I will attempt to identify some examples of best city practices. You may have noticed already something I've learned in 30 years of teaching. The faster I talk, the more ground I can cover, but I apologize if I've been going too fast for some of you. My starting point is that cities are now major players and can make a real difference in what I call the drama of migration. Immigrants arrive with hopes, dreams, and yes, anxieties too. The receiving societies also have their goals, their objectives, and concerns regarding migration. Who these days is taking the lead in trying to assure a happy rather than sad outcome in this drama of migration? I would say the most creative initiatives are coming from the ground up, from cities. And much of this evidence is on display in the new report that Cities of Migration has published that Bonnie mentioned at the outset, and that I'll be referring to further on in my presentation. It's evident, though, that migration and globalization are enabling what I call a new urban renaissance. Cities are becoming increasingly important in shaping our economic, environmental, cultural, and social future. And one of the big tests of local leadership today is getting immigration right. This means, among other things, capitalizing on the full potential of immigration, promoting immigration and integration and inclusion of newcomers and linkages to the receiving settled population, and, of course, avoiding becoming a battleground of people with different identity and different status. The world desperately needs examples of places where diversity enriches the lives of all, and cities are the place where that can best be modeled. So in many ways, I regard cities as demonstration projects for the world's future. We need them to succeed, and we especially need leaders at the local level, government officials, local NGOs, social movements, business labor leaders, the local media, colleges, universities, cultural institutions to take up that challenge. This is a civic project of capitalizing and maximizing the advantage of migration for cities. So if I turn now to my second slide, let me ask the question, so what works? What works in terms of local leadership in immigrant integration? In a moment, as I said, I will look at some of the case studies that are highlighted in the Cities of Migration report, and I certainly urge everyone to look at that report. There is a lot to learn from it. The report focuses, as you've heard, on city government-led initiatives. I was surprised by the very wide range of commitments and activities that local governments are involved in. There's hardly an area of municipal service and role responsibility, as you'll see, that isn't covered in this report. So moving on, let me try to share with you a few of the best practices in that Good Ideas report that I found especially exciting and innovative. And many of them can be characterized, I think, as small steps with big results. We are trying to build better cities and a better world here. It's surprising how often that can happen with relatively doable, small-scale, on-the-ground initiatives, and that's what I will turn my attention to next. So, Bonnie mentioned that I had been asked to review the report that is forthcoming and to address in an essay any theme that I thought was of particular interest. And the title of my essay for the collection that is forthcoming in a little while is Taking It to the Street. It examines how urban landscapes, streets, parks, and other public spaces can be planned and used to create a city open, welcoming, and with opportunity for all. So let me I see you've got, I've got that slide up just to make sure of that. There are a number of very intriguing initiatives that reflect this in the report. One comes from the City of Boston, something they call the Backstreets Program. It is a commitment by the City of Boston to assure that its planning and zoning policies preserve ethnic economies, light industries, businesses that have established themselves and that may be vulnerable to urban change or to gentrification. It's a recognition that many of these initiatives give a robustness to immigrant communities. It's also a recognition that often they can be the seeding of growing and enlarged economic activity. So this is an attempt to create petri dishes almost for the growth and expansion of immigrant and ethnic economies. There's an amazingly wonderful initiative that comes from Auckland, New Zealand. It is called the Walking School Bus, and this is literally taking it to the street. The city has worked with neighborhoods to establish 300 different routes in the city where, as if there was a motorized bus, there is a schedule for people walking a set route, parents and children, to get to school and back from school, and as they walk down the street, they pick up people who are closer to the school waiting to be picked up, and lo and behold, they end up as a whole cohort and group walking into the school together day after day after day. You can imagine the kind of networking connections, neighborhood ties that are established in that process. Parks, of course. There are many cities that are recognizing that the public space of parks are incredibly important playgrounds of not only recreation but of integration. There are many parks that are converting space to accommodate the distinctive recreational needs of newcomer and immigrant communities. Lo and behold, in parks today you will find cricket matches going on, capoeira exercises, tai chi going on. It may interest some to know we now have more soccer fields in Toronto parks than we have hockey rinks. So yes, there is a globalized impact on the global migrations and movements. This is a way that cities open themselves up to the world, open themselves up to differences. Principles, policies, and programs are one of the most important themes I want to try to highlight in my presentation, and I realize that my time is nearing an end. One of the most important things I think cities can do is to signal the values that they have related to immigration and diversity. Principles and symbols matter. I found it very compelling to read in the report the statement by the mayor of Stuttgart, Germany, who declared, "Everybody living in Stuttgart is a Stuttgarter. We do not have foreigners, we have citizens." This is a very powerful statement of inclusion and of equality. I also want to say it is an important signal of something that I call urban citizenship. Jan has mentioned that that generally nation states regulate and control citizenship. Cities are beginning to recognize that in their own way today, they can also convey and confirm an equality of all persons living in a city, regardless of what their nationality and citizenship of origin may be. Other cities make a point of signaling their commitment and embrace of diversity. My own city, Toronto, is an example of that. Its official motto is "Diversity, our strength." How do you then take these principles and operationalize them, turn them into policies and real commitments of a city? There are many ways. I'll highlight just two that are discussed in the report. One comes from Dublin, which mirrors other cities around the world, which allows non national citizens of its country to vote in municipal elections. So, like in other cities, in Dublin, you do not need to be a citizen of Ireland in order to vote in a municipal election. Again, I think this sends a very tangible message that the views and the input of all residents are wanted and needed to build the best city possible. Some cities have significant non-status populations. The city of New Haven in Connecticut, along with other cities in the United States and in Canada, has taken initiatives to try to provide some greater degree of comfort and status. One of the things New Haven has done is it now issues a municipal identification card for anyone wanting one. And if you are an undocumented migrant and you want to set up a bank account and you don't have official government documentation, that can be difficult. So this is an interesting, tangible step that cities are taking to try to make sure that the city really is a city for all. Many, many cities, of course, establish initiatives to create bridges between newcomer populations and the established settled population of their municipalities. There are three wonderful examples. There are many, but there are at least three wonderful examples in the report. One from Valongo, Portugal, a wonderful initiative called the Living Library, where what regularly happens is we typically go to libraries in search of books. In this instance, the library has programs where the Living Library is a newcomer to the city who gives a talk on their life and their experience. And that is a way for anyone in the library to learn about that person and that homeland community's migration to Portugal. Valladolid in Spain has Intercultural Week with all kinds of connectedness with newcomer communities. The Hague runs City Mondial neighborhood walking tours. This is designed to have all persons in The Hague comfortable and attached and knowing the full scope of what goes on in their city and all of its neighborhoods. So this is an initiative run by the city. It makes sure that the city is not a series of disconnected enclaves. It connects people across neighborhood space. This is, again, I think a very significant initiative. You will see in the report a number of initiatives of municipalities committed to providing equitable services for all, where cities look at everything they do and they say, is our delivery of this service meeting the needs of the diverse population we have in our community? I've highlighted a few of the examples. The one perhaps that I'll just speak to in Bilbao tries to assure that immigrant women are aware of the public health services and programs offered by the municipality to make sure that that there are no constituencies and sectors of the urban community who are unaware or unconnected to public health initiatives. The role of cities as economic engines, of course, is critical. Immigrants look for economic advancement often when they migrate. There are a number of very interesting initiatives from assuring that immigrants have business and enterprise opportunities, which you see in Vienna, and I'll drop down to London, where the city has officially sponsored and co-led a living wage campaign, which recognizes that in many immigrant cities, it is often newcomers who hold the most precarious and most difficult of jobs, and the City of London is committed to boosting wages in those sectors and has a whole campaign with a number of initiatives and commitments in that area. So I think one of the things that stands out just from this very quick review, you can see how wide-ranging the possibilities are for cities to be responsive, to take a leadership role. And I'll just close by saying what we all know. The stakes are very high. The stakes are high for immigrants and newcomers who have uprooted themselves. They are high for receiving societies and receiving cities that have much to gain, but also potentially, if things go wrong, much discord potentially to have to deal with. And cities, I would say, are in the forefront of making a difference on the ground.
Great. Thank you very much, Meyer. Well, we've heard lots of big ideas from both of our presenters today. I'm sure that you have lots of questions because I have lots of questions. So let's move on to our question and answer period. You can write your questions into the questions box, which will shortly appear in the center of your screen. You can continue to write your questions in throughout the question period. So let's get started. We saw in our reports on municipal cities, government integration practices, and throughout both of the presentations today that it seems that many local governments are looking for ways to welcome immigrants. These local governments are looking at immigrants as assets rather than as problems. And there are many reasons for this, including economic reasons. So first I'd like to ask both of you, Jan and Meyer, to comment on that. And perhaps we can start with Jan.
Yeah, just briefly, it is clear that an increasing number of cities come to that conclusion that immigrants could very well mean economic gains. And I fully understand that reasoning, and to a great extent I adhere to it. I would nevertheless also point to the fact that it is not only an economic issue we are discussing here. It is, to say the least, also a social issue. Because usually immigrants, they may come alone. They are followed by their families. They may come with the whole family. They may be an entrepreneur or a worker, invited or not invited, forced by economic circumstances in the countries of origin, or for political reasons. And then the economic argument may run dry, because these people are often in need of special treatment, for example, refugees. They have to catch up with life, which is quite different from the country of origin. They may not have work, like invited economic migrants have, who right from the start can contribute economically. So there are then social duties and health implications to have a large immigrant community around. So again, whereas I agree with the economic argument, and I adhere to it, we should not turn a blind eye for the social dimension.
So I'll say, Meyer, here that I agree very much with Jan. Bonnie, I think the question you've asked is, why should cities choose to be cities of migration? Why should cities proactively take this on as something that they commit themselves to? And certainly, I think there are economic advantages and benefits to be had. In many cities, one can identify leading local entrepreneurs who are themselves immigrants. We all know the demographic and fertility rate statistics about the need for immigrants in labor market terms. But I agree very much with Jan that it's not just an economic argument. There are ethical, humanitarian issues here. And I think also I would not minimize, diversity makes cities so much more dynamic, interesting, engaging places. It links and connects the local to the global in ways that enrich our lives socially, culturally, and in turn also, we now know, has positive economic benefits. So one of the things we know from the work of people like Richard Florida is creative cities in a knowledge economy the successful ones are highly correlated with the extent of diversity that they have. That's the nature of capital flow. It's the nature of investment flow. So I think there are all kinds of reasons to embrace cities of migration.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now I'd like to change tracks a little bit and talk a little bit about political participation. Meyer, you mentioned in your presentation, and we've sort of talked about more generally, that many cities actually give the right to vote to immigrants, including people who are not yet citizens of that country. So the first part of my question is, what benefits has non-citizen voting brought to those cities? And Maya, I'd like to start with you.
Well, I think it brings a number of benefits. It signals to newcomers that they are fully equal residents of the municipality that they have come to, that their views are wanted, that their input is wanted, and that we want them to have a full connection to the city they have moved into. And think of what the consequences are of not extending that right of voice at the municipal level to newcomers. I'll take just my hometown, Toronto, as an example. We have neighborhoods where there are over 30% of residents who are not yet Canadian citizens. And you can imagine what the implication of that is for the ability of the needs and capabilities of those neighborhoods to be recognized and understood by local governments. We recently, in fact, had a visit to Toronto from the mayor of Dublin, and he was asked this question: what's the benefit? Why do you do this? And he said it's a really important bridge to extend to newcomers to give them a sense of full membership and full belonging at the city level.
Jan?
I completely agree. Can I just put in a note here, and that is exactly the theme of my essay, namely where national and local policies, come together or fall apart, if I may say so. Mayor said that the city of Dublin or that cities across the world have given voting rights to its residents and inhabitants. I'm curious to know which cities those are, because usually it is national legislation that give that right to non-nationals. And so when a reference was made to Ireland, it is because national legislation allows it. I know that the city and civil society organizations have done a lot to then facilitate and make possible that practically people went to the polling stations, with, as it were, what they would call in the United States get out to vote strategies. But still, something else needed to be done, namely give officially a right to vote and participate in local elections. Now, with reference to the mayor of Stuttgart, who says that everyone living in Stuttgart is a citizen of Stuttgart, well, all very well, but among the countries in Europe, Germany is not the one that grant voting rights at national and local level to their immigrant population. And then, of course, that begs the question, what does that then mean, citizen of Stuttgart, if you don't have voting right? And here it would be very interesting to see mayors coming out more strongly in Europe and elsewhere and say, we need to change legislation that deals with the right to vote and stand in elections. The same applies for naturalization, because it often is said, look, you can only vote and stand for election when you have become a national. But Germany is among the countries where it is not so easy to become a German. And then I would invite mayors to say, well, let's try and join efforts in Germany, in Europe, to change national legislation so that it becomes easier to become a German.
Wonderful, Jan. Well, you've actually anticipated sort of the second part of my question, which is, for those cities that do not yet allow non-citizens to vote at the municipal level, what should be done? And you've indicated a little bit that mayors have a strong role to play. Do you have any other comments, Jan, about what else can be done in those cities?
Well, quite often you see, and it is presented as an alternative for voting right, is so-called councils, advisory councils. And Germany actually is a point in case. There are many of those, and even the councils have a national federation of those councils. And that, of course, is a kind of, well, we are not able to give you voting rights, we give you this. Now, MIPEX research demonstrated that actually where countries are more lenient to provide the right to vote to immigrants, they also often give an opportunity to create advisory councils. And where they do not give the right to vote, they reluctantly set up those advisory councils. Germany, by the way, a notable exception. So you see, if it must really be based on a political will at national and local level to give immigrant communities a voice.
Thank you. Meyer, would you like to comment?
Well, I'll start by reaching back to a number of the very important points that Jan has just made. It is true that one of the huge obstacles cities have is, generally speaking, their inferior governmental status relative to higher order or senior levels of government, national, provincial, regional. So it is true that Jan, you're absolutely right, that it is the national governments that pass enabling legislation for permitting cities to then enact local voting rights for non-citizens. The doorway gets opened at the national level. In Canada, it's at the provincial level. And if you have a reluctant and resistant province in Canada, you are not going to get the opening of voting rights. So there is this real friction and tension of cities being closest to the ground, recognizing the opportunities of integration and inclusion, but oftentimes needing to get the okay and the approval of senior levels of government that may have their own agendas at play. With regard to what alternatives can be done, yes, it is true. Many cities have advisory councils. From the experience in Canada, they are generally regarded as a weak sounding board for some, oftentimes local elites within immigrant communities to once a month have a chance to express some views. They tend not to have a very significant impact on municipal policy. There are, I think, a number of initiatives that could be taken. Some of this is the role that NGOs and that immigrant community organizations could play in terms of there are other pathways to political participation apart from the vote. There are opportunities to depute, to lobby, to petition, to organize, to demonstrate. There are those opportunities that exist. To be fair, some municipalities also make a regular habit of reaching into what they know are neighborhoods and areas with large numbers of disenfranchised residents and having large town halls regularly on local issues, local concerns. So where there's a will, there's a way, I think, to connect newcomers and immigrant communities with their local government.
Okay, so let's move on now to questions from the audience. And I see that a few members of our audience have picked up on this, again, this looking at this relationship between national and local level policy. And we've got a couple of questions on that relationship from Anta. Have there been any cases where the national government has tried to prevent the more inclusive policies that cities would try to put forward? And from Satya, who asked a similar question on, are there examples of where local policy interventions and practices have been successful in sort of compensating for national policy, like overcoming those challenges or complementing them? Meyer, maybe we could start with you.
Well, the one I can think of, and you'll pardon my parochialism, I end up knowing the city I live in best. To take one example on the very good question about can cities compensate for some of the gaps that are created by national orientations? Something that impresses me at the City of Toronto is a policy that they have regarding municipal services and programs being available to all residents of Toronto, regardless of their citizenship status. So yes, it is true. Toronto, like other global cities of migration, has undocumented, non-status, whatever term we want to use, residents. The city of many of whom have been in Toronto for a long time, many of whom make major contributions in the work that they do, in the neighborhoods they live in, have children going to school, have children going to university, but are vulnerable to the risk of potential deportation. The City of Toronto has said all Toronto services, from policing to libraries to schools to garbage collection to public health, are available to every resident of the City of Toronto. We're not asking you what your status is. We're not checking into your status. This is publicly signaled to the people of Toronto. I think this is one example in a very practical way where the city makes concrete its commitment to urban citizenship, where they're saying residence, domicile, is a basis of rights and responsibilities.
Perfect. Jan?
Well, as I indicated briefly, a lot of work can be done at a local level to implement nationally adopted policies, and that goes from education to health and anti-discrimination. There are many cities that have their own anti-discrimination bureaus, in the Netherlands, for example, but other countries have them as well, where people who are discriminated against can bring forward a complaint and so on. So that is a lot this is an area where national and local governments can work hand in hand in terms of design, adoption, and then implementation of policies. Where I often see cities tapping in where national governments drop the ball is, and Mayor mentioned it already, is on the whole issue of resident and residence rights, legal and not legal residents, undocumented or documented residents, as we used to call them. And there often cities go against government in very concrete situations. There are numerous examples where mayors go to the national capitals to plead for groups or even individual undocumented migrants who have been in the city for so long that their expulsion actually disrupt community life in cities. And then you see mayors and city councils defending the rights of those individual citizens. In that area, cities really, as I said, pick up the ball where national governments have dropped them.
Great. Thank you. Now I'd like to sort of change tracks a little bit. We've got a couple of questions from the audience about sort of which cities it is that we're talking about. From Stephanie, immigrants are now choosing to arrive and settle in different cities than in the past. And I think this is something we definitely see in Canada and the U.S. for sure. Do you see any differences in the way that these new immigrant gateways are dealing with integration versus the sort of older gateway cities that we're more familiar with? And on a related track, Rana Omidvar asks, can cities actually choose to be cities of migration, or are they cities of migration by default because of the way that globalization and migration are sort of happening? And she's asking you to comment maybe a little bit about what choice cities have in terms of receiving immigrants and what their attitudes are, and how we can sort of make these cities really inclusive from their founding principles and that. Jan, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, well, on the last question, I feel more secure to say something, because the first phenomenon, I'm not very familiar with that, and I found it very interesting, and I'm very keen to hear what my mayor has to say on that. But on the last point is cities do not become cities of migration by choice. I don't believe it. It may be their destiny. And we should not forget, urbanization is maybe another word for migration. Cities' growth, population growth, is to a great extent caused by influxes of newcomers. And again, I do not think there is a lot of choice. International movement of people in the world is not only the choice of all the individuals concerned. It is a mix of being forced for various reasons and making the best out of your situation and going, on the basis of your free will and capacity to go elsewhere. The same with cities. They have to cope with it. They can, of course, do extra efforts to attract highly skilled immigrants or specific groups of refugees if they think they have to do that as a global citizen, so to say. But that doesn't relate to the real migratory movement in the sense that it is all choice. What cities can do in addition is, and various examples are to be found in those publications, is how they make the best of it. Do they become closed, or do they really open up? And then there, I would say, there is a big choice and policy choice to be made.
Meyer.
There's a connection between those two questions that you had identified, Bonnie. So I'll try to tackle it this way. Yes, it's true that for the most part we're talking about a process where there is where interestingly immigrants are driving the outcome. In much of what goes on in migration, it's governments, it's states that are in control, but once immigrants arrive into a new country, they are free to settle where they will, and of course chain migration, which is the process by which typically migrants will go and settle in places where predecessors from their own community have settled for all kinds of obvious reasons and where they believe there are the best economic opportunities. So lo and behold, we get a strong clustering of immigrant settlement in a few areas. To prove the point, 2/3 of all immigrants in Canada are in 3 urban areas. Now, again, this is where the national starts to come in. In part, the Government of Canada has looked at this and said, we would like to promote dispersal. There are a number of municipalities that have also decided, we see the dynamism of Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. We want some of that, and so we want to try to proactively make ourselves more welcoming communities to immigrant settlement, and there is a whole initiative that is going on at a number of levels by municipalities that are not currently getting the share that they would like. And this runs everything from promotional campaigns, recruitment campaigns, work with local institutions to assure that there are integration pathways for immigrant communities. And if people are interested in more of this, I would say the poster child within Canada for this kind of resurgence is the city of Winnipeg, which has been very, very creative and successful in bringing many immigrants to its Western Canadian location. The other thing, in a way, maybe that a little bit connects to this is suburbanization. Immigrants, of course, this is the North American phenomenon. Typically, of course, you could identify the downtown street that in the 19th and 20th century was the first stepping stone for the first generation to move into. And there is the street where one wave after another of newcomers settled. That's not happening anymore. Immigrants are now dispersing geographically in much more interesting ways, oftentimes to suburbs, oftentimes transforming completely areas that had a very one-dimensional, in some ways conformist kind of mindset, and are now becoming much more diverse and dynamic settings. And I will say in the Toronto context, some of the most interesting responses that are now being developed at the local level is happening in some of those suburban areas. The last thing I'll say is we also have experience I hope I haven't given the impression that there's perfection in all that goes on in Canadian cities. We are talking about large cities. We're talking about small cities. There have been a number of instances in Canada, in cities in Quebec and cities in Ontario, where basically cities have come up with manifestos declaring to immigrants that if they want to come to their town, this is the way they better behave. And those manifestos typically contain stereotypical, prejudicial assumptions about immigrants. So yes, it is true that there are different issues and different, if I could use the word, obstacles to be overcome in different places.
Okay, we have a plethora of really good questions from the audience, and our time is getting short, so I'm going to combine a few of the questions that you've asked into this next question. 2 or 3 people have asked variations of the question, how do we sort of create buy-in, or how do we get people to sort of get on board with the idea of welcoming new immigrants? And this could apply to both local level politicians, to city staff, and to the general public. Now, we've had a number of questions from people asking about this in Canada, but I suspect this is a question that is really affecting cities in all of the cities of migration that we've been discussing today. So given that we have a short time left, Jan, I'm going to ask you to start, and perhaps we can try and keep our comments short.
I would say that cities and national governments could work together more than they are doing at this point in time in relaxing citizenship legislation, because it is a key to many issues, from political participation to sense of belonging. Still, at least in the European context, citizenship laws are not really inviting, so to say, are really trying to limit the number of naturalizations than to increase them, making it too difficult for immigrants to become a citizen of the country they live in. And again, it would be very good if we could see mayors across Europe making a strong plea to change this.
And I agree with all of that, and I'd almost summarize it by saying messaging and connecting within cities is really important. The kind of messaging that comes from civic leaders about the value of diversity, the value of migration, I think sets a tone that there is a civic culture around issues of identity that can exist on a continuum, and I think voices of community leaders are important in setting that tone. I also think that a lot of this gets many of us may have assumptions, perceptions, prejudices about differing identities, differing communities. The more we build bridges that allow for the interconnection of people, for people to get to know each other as not names, not labels, but as real people with stories behind them and aspirations and hopes, I think the stronger things are. And that means creating public space and public institutions that connect people. There has to be common ground in cities where people can connect and interact, and there are a lot of wonderful examples of that in the report.
Okay, so we've got time for one more question from the audience, and so far during our presentations and during the question period, we've talked about a lot about cities as, sort of democratic bodies, as service providers, as policymakers, and we have a question from Janet and Barbara. Can we talk a little bit about cities as employers? So local governments are generally major employers in their cities. Can we talk about some of the good practices we've seen in either recruiting or hiring, orienting, promoting, retaining, etc., their employees, and how cities can be leaders in this area? Meyer, we'll start with you.
I'll just very quickly say, I think there are a lot of cities that do this really well, that recognize that you have to have a civic workforce for all kinds of reasons that reflects the population that it serves. We don't have time to go into all the rationales, but there are many, many cities that get it. And so this has to do with how do you assure that as an employer you are as close as possible to having a representative workforce. This has to do with where and how you advertise the positions, how you encourage populations to think of themselves as wanting and being able to get career paths inside local governments. It has to do with the internal culture of organizations and assuring that there is a cross-cultural and equity ambiance to an urban area. And I'll just close by saying that from the Toronto experience, one of the leading municipal service institutions in this is the police. That there is, if you look at the graduating classes of police, it is by majority non-white and female. So there are initiatives.
Wonderful. Jan?
Yeah, and I totally agree with Meyer. Can I just add that we should not only look at the immigrant communities as workers. Among them are many entrepreneurs, so we also must ask government and local and national what it is what they do to buy their goods and services or outsource certain tasks to minority-owned and immigrant-owned businesses. This is really something that is important. The purchasing power of national and local government is enormous. Billions of euros across the globe are being spent by governments locally and nationally. Now, part of that can be used, this purchasing power can be used as a leverage also to promote, in that sense, social justice.
Thank you very much. Well, like I said, we have so many questions from our audience, and so many of them are so good. Unfortunately, we are coming to an end of our time, so I'm going to close with just one more question for each of you, and perhaps you can give me a sort of a 30-second answer. And the question is, what is the one idea or one most important thing that you think that local governments should do for immigrant integration? So, again, easiest question, 30 seconds. Let's start with Jan.
Okay, you said I had 30 minutes?
30.
No, I think if I'm forced to say it in one split of a second, I would say leadership by using language, welcoming and inclusive language on the one hand, and putting in place very good instruments to make it happen. So leadership is the word.
Great. Meyer?
Mine is a variant on Jan's, actually. It's establish a straight, direct line between core principles and how they are operationalized through policies and services at the local level.
Beautiful. That was actually less than 30 seconds each, I think. Well, that's just about all the time that we have for today. So on behalf of all of our participants, I want to thank both Jan Niesen from the Migration Policy Group in Brussels, Belgium, and Meyer Semioticki from Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. And on behalf of Jan, Meyer, and Cities of Migration, I want to thank everyone in the audience today for your thoughtful questions and for setting aside time in your busy schedules for our webinar.